Good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 25th June 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So, without any further delay, let's get into the discussion and let's understand all these important topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner, so that this discussion will be helpful for your exam preparation. So the first topic with which we're going to start the session is about the emergency that was enforced in 1975 during Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister. And recently the government has also declared June 25th as Samvidhan Hatya Divas as well. Now we'll be understanding what are the circumstances in which the emergency was declared and how the civil liberties were curbed during this emergency period. And in fact, as I have already told you, that June 25th every year is celebrated as Samvidhan Hatya Divas, right? So this is also said that the day when Constitution is dead in India, right? So because June 25th was the day the national emergency came into force, and that has severely undermined the civil liberties, severely undermined the constitutional ethos, constitutional values in India, because on that particular day the national emergency has been declared by the Indira Gandhi government in 1975. And this national emergency declaration has been made by the then President of India, Mr. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad. So Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad actually made the declaration of national emergency at that point of time. And the other thing that we should understand here is that the national emergency can be declared in certain circumstances under Article 352 of the Indian Constitution. Now, what are those circumstances in which the national emergency can be declared, right? So firstly, war. Second, external aggression. War, external aggression. And armed rebellion. Armed rebellion. Right? So these are the three grounds on which a national emergency can be declared under Article 352 of the Indian Constitution, right? So you just have to understand this, right? So therefore, this national emergency has been declared by then President of India, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, under Article 352 of the Indian Constitution. And in fact, on this day, June 25th, so on this day, there was a severe or massive suppression of civil liberties and people, and imprisonment of activists and censorship on press, right? So these are the characteristic features of national emergency that India has enforced during Indira Gandhi regime in 1975, right? So these events, all these events, for example, the censorship on press, imprisonment of activists, and suppression of the civil liberties. So all these factors are the characteristic features of the national emergency. But what actually led to the declaration of national emergency by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi at that point of time? So this was because of Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha, so who invalidated Indira Gandhi's election, and that ultimately triggered the declaration of national emergency in the year 1975, right? So since Indira Gandhi's election was invalidated by Justice Jagamohan Lal Sinha. So that has actually triggered the declaration of national emergency. Now, what are the key highlights of emergency of 1975 in India? Now, when we talk about the highlights, now Article 358 of the Indian Constitution, so it has suspended Article 19. Now, Article 19 talks about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, right? So this is a fundamental right. However, in case of national emergency is in force, Article 19 can be suspended. And suspension of Article 19 will amounts to curbing fundamental rights like freedom of speech, freedom of expression during Indian emergency period. And in fact, courts were also barred from redressing grievances. People cannot approach the courts to redress their grievances, and people cannot approach the court challenging the emergency as well. So therefore, overall it amounts to suspending the judicial oversight as well. Now, one thing that we should understand here, progressively in 1973 the judiciary has come up with the doctrine of basic structure doctrine, right? The doctrine of basic structure. So in this very doctrine itself, the Supreme Court has declared the judicial independence. The judicial independence is part of the basic structure doctrine. Judicial review is part of the basic structure doctrine. So however, here what has been happening, that people are not allowed, or they're barred from redressing their grievances through the courts, right? So there was suspension of judicial oversight as well. So that was the characteristic feature of emergency that was imposed in the year 1975. And in fact, media plays a very, very important role to inform people, but there was a censorship on media also, right? So this would severely restrict media to inform the public about the emergency. And in fact, the Press Council of India was abolished, right? So during the emergency, Press Council of India was altogether abolished, and so therefore the information can be controlled, right? So information can be controlled by the government. And elections to the Prime Minister, Lok Sabha Speaker, they actually placed beyond the judicial scrutiny, thereby further consolidating the power. However, the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, so this was passed by the Janata government after the emergency, again placed the elections of PM and Lok Sabha Speaker within the judicial scrutiny, right? So therefore, these are the characteristic features of emergency that were unfolding. And in fact, the government, in order to suppress the activists and the civil rights activists, so they started implementing the preventive detention laws as well. So therefore, implementation of these preventive detention laws have been leading to the widespread arrests, human rights violations all across India, right? For example, if the government felt that somebody is protesting against the government, is protesting against the emergency, the government used preventive detention to arrest that individual, to arrest that group of people, and pre-censorship has already been imposed on the media. And at the same point of time, Indira Gandhi also introduced 20-point program, and this 20-point program is also called as a controversial program, right? So the 20-point program essentially aimed for economic and social reforms during the state of emergency as well. So these are some key highlights of emergency of 1975 in India. And in fact, emergency is criticized because it undermined the democratic values. It undermined the democratic ethos. It severely curbed the civil liberties of the people. And India's democracy became a dictatorship at that point of time, and because of this reason, on June 25th, the government of India announced that particular day as Samvidhan Hatya Divas. And during the national emergency, so total revolution was also started by leaders like Jayaprakash Narayan. Now we'll be understanding about this total revolution. So what exactly is this total revolution? Now what is the context? So the context is that the 51st anniversary of Jayaprakash Narayan's total revolution. So this total revolution was launched on 5th June 1974. And in fact, understand, total revolution is a very important for your mains examination. It is very important for your mains examination, particularly for your general studies paper 1. So therefore, we'll understand what exactly is a total revolution, what is its objective, what is the significance of total revolution, and what are the shortcomings of the total revolution. And therefore, it has been highlighting an enduring influence that the total revolution is actually has on Indian politics. How total revolution has affected the Indian politics, influenced the Indian politics. Now when we talk about the total revolution, this is a non-violent movement that has been launched in India after India's independence, and total revolution aimed at a complete political and social transformation. Political and the social transformation in India, right? So therefore, the total revolution is actually based on the Gandhian ideals. So he has been influenced by the Gandhian ideals. So total revolution by Jayaprakash Narayan aimed at a complete political and social transformation which is based on the Gandhian ideals. Now what is the objective of this total revolution? So when we talk about the objective of this total revolution, so it is also called as Sampurna Kranti. In Hindi, the total revolution is also called as Sampurna Kranti, and in fact it is a comprehensive change in economic, social, political, cultural structure for a just and equitable society. So achieving a just and equitable society. So that essentially means that it focuses on alleviation of poverty. It focuses on reduction of income inequalities, regional inequalities. It focuses on prohibition of caste-based discrimination, upliftment of the marginalized sections of the society. So all are the objectives of the Sampurna Kranti. So through a non-violent movement, bringing or putting a lot of pressure on the government to achieve the objective of just and equitable society. Now what are the causes of total revolution? So we'll be trying to understand what are the actual causes of total revolution. Now the first is the electoral malpractices that used to take place and the judicial verdict as well. Because in 1975, Allahabad High Court came up with a judgment, and this judgment of Allahabad High Court disqualified Indira Gandhi for the potential electoral malpractices. And this particular judgment by the Allahabad High Court delegitimized Indira Gandhi's authority as the Prime Minister, and that has triggered the mass protests against the electoral malpractices and the electoral malpractices and in favor of this judicial verdict. Right? So this was the first cause. And apart from that, a Nava-Nirman movement. So this is a students' protest. Right? So this is a students' protest, which is also called as the Nava-Nirman movement. And this widespread agitation in Gujarat and even Bihar students started protesting. So this widespread agitation exposed the growing youth frustration because there existing high levels of unemployment and a frequent government failures as well. Frequent government failures and very high levels of unemployment, and because of this reason it triggered the Nava-Nirman movement in Gujarat and students protests in Bihar as well. And apart from unemployment, government failures, electoral malpractices, there was also a severe inflation. So inflation above 20%, right? So inflation more than 20%. So inflation actually means that increase in the prices of goods. Now the poor people may not be able to afford the basic things which are necessary for their sustenance because of high inflation. Secondly, the higher levels of unemployment. So that was also another factor which has contributed to the Sampurna Kranti movement. And there was existing the food shortages as well, high food shortages for the people, and that even triggered the Sampurna Kranti movement. Right? So all these factors have contributed for the anger and frustration and disillusionment with the state. Right? So state needs to perform the function of welfare state. Right? State needs to perform the function of welfare state, but there was a high inflation and people are not able to afford the basic things that they actually wanted for their sustenance, and they were not able to get the gainful employment opportunities, and they were also facing the food shortages. So all these factors have created the public misery and disillusionment among the people, and it even led to the erosion of the democratic norms as well, because it leads to the centralization of power. Right? So because at that point of time the government has started using the draconian laws such as MISA and suppression of dissent by the people, alarmed the civil society and the intelligentsia as well. Right? So there was a severe erosion of the democratic norms as well, and inspirational leadership. So Jayaprakash Narayan articulation on the partyless democracy. So he emphasized on democracy, but there should be a partyless democracy. And along with partyless democracy, so he even combined this partyless democracy with the Gandhian ethics and Sarvodaya ideas. Now what are these Sarvodaya ideas? Now, when we talk about the Sarvodaya ideas, so there are two things, Antyodaya and Sarvodaya. So Sarvodaya is development of all, development or a welfare of all. Right? So that is Sarvodaya. So therefore Jayaprakash Narayan through this Sampurna Kranti movement combined the partyless democracy, Gandhian ethics and the Sarvodaya concept and the Marxist critique. So thereby galvanizing a broad-based social mass movement. So that is the Sampurna Kranti movement or the total revolution. Now, what are the basic components of the total revolution? So if you look at the basic components of the total revolution, so it culminated into a political revolution because it started advocating the bottom-up governance. For example, if I can say the example of bottom-up governance is 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment. And again, the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment and Article 40 of the Indian Constitution. So they talks about the participatory governance, they talks about the bottom-up governance, and even accountability to counter the bureaucratic centralism. Now, at that point of time, the bureaucracy used to play a larger role, and that led to the bureaucratic centralism. Right? So there was no decentralization, there was no power with the no power with the people, no power in the hands of the people. So there was existing bureaucratic centralism, and this bureaucratic centralism also leads to the high levels of corruption, and bureaucracy lost touch with the people. So therefore, the total revolution also emphasized on the political revolution as well. And the second feature is the economic revolution, right? So this is the second component. Now, when we talk about the economic revolution, at that point of time, there was existing high levels of poverty, and inequalities were also existing. So inequalities in the sense that both income inequalities and regional inequalities were also existing. So therefore, the total revolution actually sought equitable land redistribution. So therefore, it talked about the land reforms as well. Right? So even though land reforms were not successful in India, the total revolution emphasized on implementation of land reforms, and the models of development should be people-centric development models. Right? So whatever development models, whatever welfare policies that you brought in, they should be people-centric development models, and they will help tackle the socio-economic disparities as well. So the third factor is social revolution. So it has also brought in the social revolution. Now, when we talk about the social revolution, at that point of time, the society was stratified in a hierarchical setup. The caste-based discrimination was existing, and the lower caste people were not able to get the basic education, and women were made to distance themselves from the education access by the society. Right? So there was existing gender discrimination, gender inequality, and caste-based discrimination was also existing. So therefore, the social revolution as a component of total revolution emphasized on eradication of the caste system. Remember, the eradication of the caste system is an important thing that was even taken up by the leaders pre-independence. But after independence, total revolution even emphasized on the eradication of casteism, gender discrimination, and even dowry to build an egalitarian society. So there should be no dowry, no caste system, and no gender discrimination, and that will help build an egalitarian society, that will help achieve an egalitarian nation. And it even brought in the educational revolution as well, because it has actually proposed ethics based curriculum. So there should be a curriculum in every school, and that particular curriculum is ethics based curriculum. So therefore, the curriculum should focus on the civic duties of the people, rural development, vocational empowerment. So all these factors that it emphasized upon. And what apart from that, the cultural and spiritual revolution is also part of it, right? Because it aimed for fostering self-discipline, national unity among the people, and the moral rejuvenation through the individual transformation. So therefore, the political revolution, economic revolution, social revolution, educational revolution, and cultural and spiritual revolution. So all these factors are the basic components of the total revolution that has been started by JP Narayan. So what is the significance of the total revolution? So we have to understand the significance as well. Now, when we talk about the significance of total revolution, so it has led to the revival of dissent tradition. So the dissent tradition has revived. So dissent essentially means that, for example, you have the capacity and the ability to question, to oppose the government policies, the intent and objective of the government policies, and that is the dissent. And dissent is the beauty of democracy. So therefore, the total revolution has actually reaffirmed dissent as a democratic right. In any democracy, dissent is a basic right that every individual equips himself or herself with. And legitimizing protests in post-colonial India as well. Now we need to talk about the new leadership pipeline that has been started by this Sampurna Kranti movement, because it has created a fresh generation of leaders with mass roots, and many of whom dominated Indian politics for several decades as well. And this total revolution further exposed the already existing systematic vulnerabilities. For example, the total revolution criticized the bureaucratic centrality. So it criticized the corruption in bureaucracy. So it started protesting against the electoral malpractices that used to take place. It protested against the dictatorial tendencies that were existed. Therefore, it has catalyzed the institutional reforms. It has catalyzed the institutional reforms to safeguard the democratic structures. And civil society. So civil society obviously play a very informed role. So it plays a very wider role and a very important role, because civil society can empower the people. So civil society can actually provide a space for people to come in and participate, thereby influencing the governance beyond the electoral politics. Right? So the contemporary lessons that we can actually learn from the total revolution. So it actually offers enduring relevance in tackling the present day issues like centralization, youth alienation, and the democratic erosion as well. So this is the significance of the total revolution. I hope you have understood. Remember, this total revolution is very important for your gender studies paper 1. There were instances of this question asked in mains examination as well. So therefore, you have to understand and know about this total revolution. Now, next is the Sustainable Development Report of 2025. Now we'll be understanding what is the Sustainable Development Report 2025. What are the Sustainable Development Goals? The context is that India has for the first time ranked top 100. Right? So India's rank is 99th in the Sustainable Development Report of 2025. Right? So this Sustainable Development Report is released by United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So this particular agency releases the Sustainable Development Report, and in this year Sustainable Development Report, India ranked 99th. And in fact, this is the 10th edition of the Sustainable Development Report. I hope this is clear for you. Now, in fact, Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals, 17 most ambitious goals, and they were adopted in the year 2015 with the objective of achieving all these 17 Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. Now, if I can tell you the examples of the Sustainable Development Goals, so they include zero hunger, no poverty, healthcare, education, gender equality, and reducing the regional inequalities, income inequalities. So focusing on life on land, life below water, right? So these are 17 ambitious sustainable development goals that have to be achieved by the year 2030. Now in this context, the sustainable development report, so the sustainable development report is the world's most authoritative ranking on the progress that the countries have achieved on sustainable development goals. Total 17 sustainable development goals with 169 targets. 169 targets and 17 goals. And in fact, so the sustainable development goals have been adopted by 193 United Nations member countries. And in this sustainable development report of 2025, the top ranking countries are the Finland. So they are the Scandinavian countries. Finland, Sweden ranked second, and Denmark ranked third. So these countries are the top rankers in the sustainable development report of 2025. Now, what are the key highlights of the Sustainable Development Report of 2025? Now, when we talk about the key highlights of Sustainable Development Report 2025, in fact, 190 out of 193 United Nations member countries, so they have already submitted the voluntary national reviews. And in fact, the voluntary national reviews indicate countries' active participation in implementation of all 17 sustainable development goals. So indicating that countries have been making progress to achieve the sustainable development goals by the year 2030. So therefore, since around 190 countries have already submitted this voluntary national reviews, so it actually reflects what? It reflects a broader engagement, right? So it reflects a broader engagement of almost all countries on the implementation of the 17 sustainable development goals. So however, when we talk about the implementation and achieving progress on the sustainable development goals, the East Asian and South Asian countries have been taking the lead, because these regions have so far show the fastest SDG progress since 2015, because 2015 was the year in which the sustainable development goals have been adopted, right? So it has been driven by a rapid socio-economic growth and the targeted policies that were adopted. And in fact, Europe tops, because if you look at the sustainable development solutions, sustainable development report of 2025, so the top 3 countries are from Europe itself, right? So around 19 out of 20 top performing countries are the European countries, right? So 19 out of 20 top performing countries are European countries. So therefore it has been highlighting the long-term investment in social welfare and the green transitions as well. However, none of the 17 sustainable development goals are fully on track, right? So remember, I've told you that there are 17 sustainable development goals and 169 targets. But none of the 17 sustainable development goals are fully on track all across the globe. Only 17% of the targets progressing. So therefore it has been signaling a serious implementation gap that has been existing. And there's also a wider fiscal gap as well. So wider fiscal gap in the sense that in order to implement the sustainable development goals, countries need to have adequate finances. For example, one goal is zero poverty, zero hunger, or alleviation of poverty. So in order to alleviate the poverty, countries need to have the the fiscal capacities, right? So nearly 50% of the countries, so they lack the sufficient fiscal capacity. They lack sufficient fiscal capacity. So the sufficient fiscal capacity to fund the sustainable development goal priorities, aggravating the developmental inequality, right? So for example, developmental inequality in the sense that around 19 countries out of 20 top performing countries, they are European countries. But think about other countries like countries in Latin America, countries in Africa and South Asia. They are poorly performing. So therefore, there is also a developmental inequality across global north and global south as well. And the current global financial architecture, so that actually favors rich countries starving the emerging and middle developing economies, because the poor countries, developing countries, underdeveloped countries actually require more and more capital to achieve to implement these sustainable development goals and achieve the meaningful progress as well. Now, what are the key challenges to SDG progress? So there are some key challenges in the implementation or progress of the sustainable development goals. Now, firstly, the geopolitical conflicts which have been existing. So geopolitical conflicts in the sense that the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel and Gaza or Hamas conflict. So these conflicts and wars actually disrupt the SDG delivery, particularly a fragile and conflict prone states, right? So therefore there existing the geopolitical conflicts. For example, in African countries, they are suffering from instability, frequent military coups and civil wars. Don't you think that all these factors, so they disrupt the delivery of SDGs? And in fact, the debt burden is also another major problem that the low and middle income countries have been facing, because they lack the fiscal capacity. They lack the fiscal capacity, and this fiscal capacity is very, very important to implement the sustainable development goals. And lack of fiscal capacity actually dent countries' ability to invest. In the implementation or achieving progress in the sustainable development goals and launching the welfare programs as well. And in fact, climate change is another phenomenon that has been further aggravating the implementation of the sustainable development goals or achieving the targets by 2030, because climate change very often leads to the food insecurity in the sense that, for example, lack of rainfall, frequent droughts or floods. So all these factors have been making agriculture a failed venture, and that leads to the food insecurity. And inequality is also another major problem because of frequent weather related disasters, climate change driven disasters, very often keeping people in the chronic cycle of poverty, and this further leads to the inequality. The rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming more and more poor. And in fact, with climate change, another phenomenon that has been simultaneously taking place, that is the biodiversity loss. So all these factors have been undermining the sustainable development goals overall progress and implementation. And there existing the weak financing mechanisms as well, because the global finance disproportionately benefits the wealthy countries, and it has been neglecting the emerging, middle and developing economies. So because of this particular reason, they are very often underfunded for sustainable development, because they don't have the capacities, they don't have the funds for the implementation of the sustainable development goals. And apart from the funding constraints, many countries are also having the structural weaknesses such as a lack of institutional capacity or weak institutional capacity, and poor governance is in place. Poor governance is in the sense that there is no participation of people in the governance process, higher levels of corruption, bureaucratic centrality, political corruption, and the crony capitalism with that has been existing, and lack of data driven planning with respect to the SDG implementation. So these are the major challenges that the sustainable development goals have been facing in several countries, but mostly in the developing countries, because they have the funding constraints, so they have the weak institutions, and climate change has been further exacerbating the inequalities and further limiting the abilities of the countries to implement the sustainable development goals, the debt burden that the poor countries have, and the geopolitical conflicts as well. So therefore there should be a sustained mechanism to finance the poor, developing and underdeveloped countries to achieve the objectives of the sustainable development goals by the year 2030. And also there is a need to focus on reducing the developmental inequalities across global north and global south as well. So the next important topic is about the gender equity in the urban bureaucracy. So firstly, we'll be understanding the context. So the context is that in urban bureaucracy there is a less representation of a woman. So therefore there is a need to substantially increase women's participation in urban governance, urban bureaucracy. Now, women's representation in grassroots politics has increased significantly in recent times. So it is well known fact that the women representation has been increasing substantially. So one example I would like to give is 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act itself. It has reserved 33% of the total seats at all levels for women. Right? So I hope it is clear for you. Right, so therefore women's representation in grassroots politics in India has increased significantly. However, their presence in administrative and bureaucratic cadres, so this remains disproportionately low. Right, so their presence is actually disproportionately low in administrative and bureaucratic cadres in urban areas. And the urban India as of now has been undergoing the rapid urban transformation, and the rapid urban transformation expected to continue over the coming decades as well. Right, so in fact it is also said that the urban areas are the growth engines of Indian economy. However, by 2050 over 800 million Indians, 800 millions are expected to live in urban areas. So 800 million, actually half of India's population by the year 2050 will reside in urban areas, will reside in urban centers. So therefore this actually makes India the largest contributor to the global urban growth as well, because a large amount of India's population will live in urban areas. So therefore it would contribute to the largest urban population, a largest urban global growth. And in recent times there is also a phenomenon that has been coming into limelight, that is expansion of the cities as well. So cities have been expanding spatially, economically and demographically, and this transforming the overall social fabric as well. Now in fact gender gap is also existed in urban governance and bureaucracy, because over the last 3 decades India has implemented the progressive constitutional reforms. Right, for example 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act, 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, and apart from that recently 106th Constitutional Amendment Act that has reserved 33% of seats for women in Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies. And 73rd and 74th again, they have reserved 33% of the seats for women in the panchayats and municipalities. So therefore, India over a period of time has implemented the progressive constitutional reforms, and these progressive constitutional reforms aimed at achieving the gender equity, with the focus of achieving gender equity. And in fact, so as I have already talked about the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act as well. However, despite it is 33% of the reservation that has been mandated by the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, so several states has increased this reservation quota for women to 50%. Right? So in India, around 17 states plus one union territory, 17 states plus one union territory, states like Kerala, Bihar. So these states have made this number to this quota to 50%. So 50% of the total seats are reserved for the women at all levels. However, as of 2024, women make up over 46% of the local elected representatives, right? So women are around 46% of the total elected representatives at the local level as per the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. And in fact, there is also a visible rise in women representation. For example, the mayors, councillors. So all these factors have been reflecting the enhanced political participation at the grassroots level. So political participation of the women at the grassroots level, despite the social structure, is not in favor of women's participation, women's active participation at the grassroots level. However, so when we talk about the urban administrative architecture, so that actually executes these decisions, and it has been comprising of city managers, city planners, engineers and police. So they actually remain predominantly dominated by the male members only. So this gender imbalance which has been existing in administrative cadres, so that restrict cities' ability to respond inclusively and equitably to all citizens, right? Because there is inadequate representation of women in urban governance, and that makes the urban governance not inclusive. It is not able to respond inclusively and equitably to the needs of all citizens. So this has to be kept in mind. Now, in this context, gender budgeting is a very, very important that can potentially increase women's participation in the urban governance. Right? So that can actually bring gender equity in the urban bureaucracy or urban governance. Now, this gender responsive budgeting is considered as a key tool that integrates gender considerations into the public finance, but it remains underutilized in Indian urban governance, right? So this gender budgeting is considered as a key instrument because that can integrate gender considerations into the public finance, but it remains underutilized in Indian urban governance. So this gender responsive budgeting that has been introduced globally in the decade of 1990s, and this gender responsive budgeting actually challenges the pre-existing myth of the gender neutral budgets, because it has revealed how public spending can reinforce the inequities. Now, India has introduced the gender budget statement in the year 2005 and 2006. So you have to remember this. So with Delhi, Tamil Nadu, Kerala have been leading the efforts in this gender budgeting. And in fact, when we talk about Delhi, so it has invested in women-only buses, and it has focused on improving the public lighting as well. So to ensure the safety and security of women, and that is very important. And Tamil Nadu has also applied the gender responsive budget, planning 64 departments in 2022-23, and Kerala even embedded gender goals through the People's Plan campaign. Now, when we talk about the gender responsive budgeting, states like Delhi, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala are leading the efforts. However, studies by UN Women and National Institute of Public Finance and Policy highlighted some issues, such as weak monitoring has been existing, and there is a weak or limited institutional capacity to ensure the gender budgeting, particularly in the smaller cities. And gender responsive budgeting often remains a tokenistic because it has been ignoring the core urban concerns like pedestrian safety and the child care infrastructure as well. Right? So these are the issues that have to be focused on to achieve the meaningful participation of women in the urban governance and urban bureaucracy, because that makes the urban governance more inclusive and equitable. Because women are already fairly represented at the grassroots level, but there is a lack of fair representation of women in the urban governance, and that has to be focused upon. And anyway, that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like a lecture, so please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit a like. Thank you.